Considering its genesis as the even more obscure and nerdy, tangential cousin of black metal in the 1990s, dungeon synth as a concentrated form of cultural expression has been at an apex for a number of years by now. The emergence of the now esteemed Dungeon Synth blog by Andrew Verdner in 2011 showed many of us the trapdoor through which we began our journeys into the subterranean crypts, wherein was forged a litany of new material adopting the Dungeon Synth banner. To this day, it is still an ever-growing scene, with dozens of albums added to the repertoire each week, new classics coming along frequently, and the boundaries of the genre seemingly shifting all of the time. By now we've seen every iteration of the form. Cozy dungeon synth, Tolkien synth, nautical themed synth, dinosaur synth, and dungeon wave. The list is endless. There are as many iterations of dungeon synth as there are artists making it, and each of these efforts adds something new, yet seemingly familiar, to the pantheon. Taking this wide spectrum of interpretations into consideration, by this point to call dungeon synth a single genre would seem to be somewhat reductive, perhaps even doing the artists working within the scene a disservice. Certainly we know dungeon synth when we hear it, but we might struggle to convey exactly what it is that constitutes dungeon synth, or to succinctly articulate the specific feelings that are evoked in us when we hear it. If we look at some of the most well-regarded dungeon synth albums, we might be able to point to some common themes, perhaps in tone, sound choice, compositional structure, or artwork. But just as we arrive at what seems to be a definitive analysis, a new release will come along that shatters our attempts at definition. Yet the strange thing is, as well as blurring the boundaries of what we know as dungeon synth, each new classic that emerges from obscurity seems as if it has always been there, as if it occupies some essential position in the landscape and always has. So, if pinning down dungeon synth is so difficult, how can we even begin to delve more deeply into its shadowy realms? Perhaps, if it cannot be defined narrowly as a genre, dungeon synth can be more accurately described as a method, a way of imagining and of presenting those imaginings to other people. If we conceptualise dungeon synth as a method, this opens up possibilities for more in-depth analysis, and allows us to consider and include all of those peripheral works that, on a superficial level at least, seem to share very little with the more traditional and easily recognised classics of the genre. But if dungeon synth is a method, what would that method be? One way to conceptualise dungeon synth is to think of it as the creation of fantastical space. That is, to recognise that whilst tone, imagery, aesthetics and structure may differ wildly, one thing that dungeon synth commonly strives to do is place the listener in a space in which they can use the music as a foundation for building and experiencing their own fantastical worlds. But that doesn't seem quite enough. Indeed, many art forms create space that can be used as a jumping off point for the imagining of fictional worlds. Dungeon synth does something different. It doesn't merely create space, it creates ruins. Dungeon synth, with its emphasis on decayed sounds, archaic modes, grainy aesthetics, reliance on nearly forgotten technology and often underproduced recordings, presents fantastical spaces that have already succumbed to the process of ruination. What we have left when listening to dungeon synth is the decayed remnants of a fantastical space, one in which we can glimpse its former glories, or the ghosts of battle and conquest, or the time-worn skeletons of kings and queens, the well-treaded paths through labyrinthine structures that crumble even as we wander through them, the blasted, desolated landscapes and overgrown cobbled roads. What dungeon synth artists present to us then rather than fully fleshed out worlds, are the ruins of those worlds, their dusty echoes throughout time. And ruins, as incomplete objects full of gaps and voids and half things, force the person encountering them to fill in the gaps themselves, to flesh out the ruins using their own imagination, to imagine what might once have been. Ruins are deeply meditative. We often see them as beautiful, but also they are the scars of the past upon our present landscape. They make us wonder about the faded lives of the individuals who once inhabited them. They show us the very real effects of the passage of time and the inevitability of decay and collapse. Similarly, Dungeon Synth encourages us to meditate on the collapse of the fantastical, the ill effects of warfare and plague and tyranny upon the formerly fantastic landscape. It presents to us half-shadows of characters, monsters, and the monstrous humans of decayed empires. It shows us plague and pestilence, and the very real effects of those things on people and places. Dungeon Synth doesn't merely describe these collapsed fantasies, but evokes it through method. The decayed, crumbling sounds of outmoded synthetic instrumentation, the xeroxed, grainy artwork of darkness-wreathed individuals in stark black and white, individuals for whom all distinguishing features are lost within the contrast, leaving just the edges of individuals, the remains of those individuals after ruination. If pressed, it would be difficult to discern from within Dungeon Synth's vast array of worlds any specific heroes or any specific characters beyond these faded archetypes and whispers. Whereas most fantasy fiction deals in the heroic, the individual pitted against the realm, Dungeon Synth favours presenting to us the realm itself, the realm that is left behind in the wake of heroes and villains. It gives us the lingering remnants of emotions, the echo of the war horn across the ruined battlefield, the blasted plains and frozen mountain ranges, and half-conquered fortresses, and it lets us wonder them as ghosts. In this sense, Dungeon Synth differs from many other fantastical modes, such as power metal or fantasy literature. It shares more in common, as any Dungeon Synth listener will attest, with role-playing games, choose-your-own adventure books, low-budget fantasy movies, and LARPing. Perhaps this is what differentiates Dungeon Synth from other, ostensibly similar styles of fantasy music. It doesn't present to us a world alive with inhabitants and possibility, with quests around every corner, but rather a world almost faded. The bones of civilizations, the scarred landscapes and long-forgotten dynasties, the edges of realms. In its 20+ years, Dungeon Synth has presented to us the crumbling remains of 1,000 different fantastical worlds. It's only right we explore them and see what it is we can learn.